The issue is that the United States continues to be unreasonable in negotiations with the Iranians. The Iranians have done a lot in order to try to accommodate the Americans.
First of all, I just have to say, I mean, come on. It seems like you all can't determine who's the good guy here and here's the evil. And by the way, I'm
You're
not
the
even a big
bad
fan.
guys, for God's sake.
Yeah, exactly.
So America's wasted its time invading other countries, blowing up the rest of the planet, trying to control the oil system, rather than building its own infrastructure.
So
China
you're
is
saying,
the winner.
And by the way, the real reason OPEC is falling apart is that the country that has the most oil and gas in the world is the United States. We're the number one producer now, which is amazing.
China has the internal infrastructure to survive, whereas the West has outsourced its survival. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean...
Today, we are reacting to a heated exchange between Professor Steve Keen and American economist Stephen Moore on China and the US-Iran war. Also, Professor Jiang joins the discussion and gives us his take in this matter. But before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe. It really helps supporting the channel grow. Okay, let's get to it.
Professor Jiang, let me bring you back into the debate here. Welcome back to Uncensored. We always get a great reaction when you come on, so thank you for sparing me some of your valuable time. Stephen mentioned there China and why China isn't doing more to help. It is interesting because China really gets more energy through the Strait than anybody else in the world, and therefore has a bigger vested interest, you would think, in getting it reopened as soon as possible. Why is China kind of sitting this out?
Well, China is not sitting this out. We have the ceasefire in place because China did a lot of backdoor diplomacy in order to pressure the Iranians to attempt a ceasefire. This is out of character for China. China does not like to involve itself in other nations' affairs. And so I think without Chinese pressure, we would not have the IRGC agreeing to the ceasefire in the first place. The issue is that the United States continues to be unreasonable in negotiations with the Iranians. The Iranians have done a lot in order to try to accommodate the Americans. But, when J.D. Vance went to Pakistan for the first time to negotiate with the Iranians, basically, it was a very heavy-handed ultimatum to the Iranians. And after that, I think that the Iranians recognized that there really is no hope in negotiating with the Americans. The Americans want to escalate. Why the Americans want to escalate, we don't know, but we can expect that over the next few weeks, the escalation will increase. Trump has talked about using U.S. naval ships to escort oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. This is clearly a provocation, and we might have a Gulf of Tonkin incident, which will allow Trump to justify a ground invasion.
Exactly. China didn't sit it out. China brokered the ceasefire through diplomacy, even though the agreements have been not honored time and time again by the Americans. But if China interferes, why do you do it? And if they don't, then let's criticize Beijing's absence. Professor Jiang's prediction is chilling and precise. We might have a Gulf of Tonkin incident which will allow Trump to justify a ground invasion. This is how American wars start. Not with threats, but with manufactured crises. But finally, we should not be asking, why is China not doing more? But rather, why are not the Europeans pressuring America to end this war? Especially that they are very vocal in their opposition.
A ground invasion, Steve Keen, would be, to me, just pouring fuel onto what is already a burning fire of mayhem over there, which I think could be horrendous for the United States.
Absolutely. And I think the soldiers on the ships are having much the same reactions. We don't know whether the nuclear aircraft carriers taken out by Iranian attacks or by sailors stuffing their own clothing into the sewerage system to block it and force it out of the conflict. Those are our two choices. You have probably the least willing American military in the history of America's military incursions, supposed to go up against a country of 90 million people who know they face an existential risk. It's absolutely ludicrous to be talking about ground troops going into that part of the world. And I've had, I'm not an expert in military matters either. We've all acknowledged that. But from what I've got from reports of people who I know are experts in that that area, unless the Americans have Star Wars style weapons to use against the Iranians, then this is going to be a slaughter of those American troops. And then I completely agree. This has probably been set up as another false flag, which America should be famous for. The Gulf of Tonkin, which dragged them into the Vietnam conflict in the first place, was put across as an attack by American ships in international waters. It was actually an American attack within Vietnamese waters. All this stuff, America sets up these wars and then loses them.
Right on the spot. False flags to set up wars no one wanted. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. The official story was North Vietnamese boats attacked U.S. destroyers in international waters, but declassified NSA documents prove the August 4th, 1964 attack never happened. The Johnson administration used a fictional attack to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, plunging America into a war that killed 58,000 Americans and 3 million Vietnamese. The soldiers know that the politicians won't admit this isn't a winnable war. It's a slaughter waiting to happen. Keen's Star Wars weapons line is dark humor masking a dark truth. America doesn't have a technological solution, so the history is repeating itself one more time.
First of all, I just have to say, I mean, come on. It seems like you all can't determine who's the good guy here and who's the evil. And by the way, I'm not even a big fan. You're the bad
guys, for God's sake.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's my point. If you actually think that we're the bad guys and the Iranians are the good guys, you have a personality disorder, my friend.
I'm sorry.
And it really is amazing that you think that we're the villains here and that this is a regime. And by the way, again, I wasn't even necessarily in favor of this incursion in the first place. But come on, this is a regime that was killing thousands, murdering their own people. This was a regime that's building a nuclear weapon. So how are we the bad guys by trying to save lives? And I do think, look, I think to Trump's credit, he did view this as a humanitarian mission to save lives that were being slaughtered. Now, in terms of our economy, look, we've had now 5.5 years of Trump's presidency with an incredibly strong economy. Trumponomics has worked. If it hadn't been for COVID, Trump would have been reelected with a 40-state reelection landslide. The economy was very strong going into 2026. And it's true that the Iran situation has really changed that picture dramatically, which is why Trump really needs to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. But by the way, I'm not just attacking Steve. I think there are a lot of foreign leaders too who can't seem to figure out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here. That's very troubling to Americans.
I was facing being conscripted to fight for freedom in Vietnam. And the one thing that threw me is, why am I being conscripted to fight for freedom? Okay, you go into Vietnam, you attack it, your whole thing is about going to stop the communist invasion of Southeast Asia. Who was the first country Vietnam has a war with? China, the first and last war. That turned out completely against what you thought was going to happen. Afghanistan, Iraq.
I was against all those things.
You should be against this one as well. Grow up. Okay, if you can't realize that America
I'm saying,
is the evil empire here, then you've...
It's the United States. You're saying the United States is the evil empire.
Yes, the United States began this. What country has invaded America? How many countries has America invaded? Please, stop reading Hollywood scripts and realize which planet you're on.
I seem to think that 9/11 was an attack on America. Maybe you don't agree with that, but...
Yes, okay. That's which country I said before.
Oops, you forgot about that one, right?
No, I didn't forget. I said country, and no country did that. That was a rogue, and the rogues came from Saudi Arabia, not from the bloody country you rated in the results to it. You guys have got a Hollywood version of your own history. It's a joke from the outside. Nobody takes you seriously anymore.
Before the evil empire, why is it every immigrant in the world wants to come to the United States?
Nobody wants to go there now, mate. And you are going down.
You should be at the border. You should see.
Stephen Moore's entire argument collapses in real time, and Professor Keen calls it out immediately. But Moore can't reference data, history, or a single fact, just personality disorder, because he can't argue with facts, so let's attack Professor Keen's character. But the point that the regime was killing thousands, let's say, is true for the sake of the argument. Many American allies have done such thing, but Moore's never demanded invasion in those countries. However, Professor Keen's final exchange is devastating. What country has invaded America? How many countries has America invaded? No response.
President Jiang, let me bring you back in here. People are looking at manufacturing resilience as one of the reasons why China ultimately will prevail here in the economic aspect of what is going on. That China's moved beyond cheap labor to advanced automation. Steve Keen has noted that if global trade stops, China has the internal infrastructure to survive, whereas the West has outsourced its survival. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the past couple months, China has been much more resilient and much more able to adapt to a new economic circumstance than other countries in Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines and Thailand. And Japan's also a lot of stress as well. So it seems like the Chinese government has been preparing for this eventuality for a long, long time. They've been very strategic. They've been very long-term in their thinking. The issue is that the long-term strategic scenario does not favor China because China is still an economy that depends on exports. And if there are these wars raging around the world, then it's going to be very hard for China to export its manufactured goods to the rest of the world. The second issue is that China consumes a lot of resources. Yes, I do understand that China has renewables, and I do know that China has a lot of inventory and stockpiles, but eventually all this is going to run out. So from a long-term strategic perspective, China is not as well adapted to a change as, say, maybe Russia or the United States.
Professor Jiang makes a good point. China has been more resilient because Beijing prepared strategically for decades and not by accident. That's planning. But I disagree somewhat with this assessment that long-term strategic scenario does not favor China. Hear me out. Over the past several years, China's trade patterns have shifted dramatically. In 2023 to 2024, China's combined exports to ASEAN, Latin America, Africa, and BRICS nations officially surpassed its total exports to the US, EU, and Japan combined. And initiatives like the Belt and Road have successfully embedded Chinese machinery, green technology, EVs, and consumer goods into developing economies. We are talking about the entire global South, 85% of humanity, the fastest growing markets and economies on Earth. And yes, I'm aware we have to take into account the purchasing power, but think about this. Emerging markets have consistently outpaced developed nations in GDP growth rates over the past 2 decades.
Steve Keen, what is your prediction? We've talked about what is happening and what we feel about it, but what is your prediction for how this plays out?
I'm terrified about what the consequences could be here because the Iranians have done a very clever tactic of basically guerrilla warfare at a national level, far beyond what the Vietnamese were ready for in the very first instance. And they are doing tit for tat. Anybody who's been a supporter of America, of course, that includes the Arab principalities and kingdoms and the Israelis as well, will be retaliated for any attack done on specific similar resources inside Iran itself. Now, there's already been one attack on a desalination plant in Iran, and I think I've seen figures to say that 96% of Iran's water is natural. You look at the other side, the Arabian states, some of them have 96% dependence upon desalination. If it goes that far, then we will, and you have no idea how this stupid attack is going to turn out, then that could mean that those areas have to be evacuated because people are not going to starve to death. They're going to die of thirst. Now, this is the horrific possibilities here are just ludicrous, and it's absolutely a monumental failure of judgment to begin this conflict in the first place.
Well, this is to be expected. Iran's asymmetric warfare is strategic. Tit for tat, targeting of critical infrastructure, desalination plants, oil facilities, shipping lanes. The Houthis in the Red Sea were the preview. But Professor Keen's water point is devastating. 96% of Iran's water is natural. The Gulf Arab states, 96% dependent on desalination. All Iran needs is one precision strike on the wrong facility, and you're talking about mass evacuation of cities, millions of people with no water. Professor Keen calls it a monumental failure of judgment, but that's generous. America started a war with a country 4 times Iraq's size, with mountainous terrain, regional proxy networks, and nothing to lose. I think the Afghanistan's fiasco was a lesson for the world, but some didn't get it.
I don't know kind of where to start. I would simply say that, I mean, one really, really positive thing that's happened the last couple of weeks is the UAE dropping out of OPEC. And by the way, the real reason OPEC is falling apart is that the country that has the most oil and gas in the world is the United States. We're the number one producer now, which is amazing. And how do you have a cartel when the number one producer isn't part of your cartel? So whether you like Donald Trump or not, everybody has to agree that his drill baby drill strategy has been amazing for the U.S. economy, that it's made us less reliant, although we're still reliant on Middle East oil, made us much less so. So I think the approach going forward for the U.S. should be produce as much energy as we possibly can at home, our oil, our gas, our coal, our nuclear power. And when it's appropriate, we could maybe get some oil energy from wind and solar, use it all so that we don't have to be captive to the Middle East any longer.
But is it naive? Is it naive, Stephen, for President Trump to take a view of, this is not our problem, right? The energy part of this. We produce our own energy, almost pretending there isn't a global energy economy.
No, that's true. I'm not.
That America inevitably will be dependent on.
Of course, and there's a global oil supply and a global oil, demand. And what I'm saying is that we can somewhat inoculate ourselves from that because the more and more we produce, the more valuable the oil is.
Well, when Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, which handles 20% of global oil shipments, American gas prices spike regardless of domestic production. That's what global energy economy means. But I find very interesting that Stephen Moore sees any positive in this mess. What about attacking another country? The casualties, the hit to the economy. Millions of ordinary people, not only in America, but globally, are going through economic hardship because of this. I don't know what you think, but so far, Stephen Moore has not delivered any point that makes any sense.
Professor Jiang, just finally, are we heading for a global recession, do you think?
I think that we are heading towards a global depression, and this is a process that could take decades. We are in a new normal. We are in the undiscovered country. We are the level of destruction, the level of pain and suffering that we are moving towards is unimaginable. So buckle up.
Can I answer that question?
Yes.
Look, we are entering the greatest period of the greatest productivity revolution in the history of civilization. Nothing will, over the next 10 years, we'll never see anything like what is coming with respect to this incredible robotics revolution.
Okay, so we have two options, Steve Keen, finally. One is a global depression over the next few decades. The other one is a global explosion of euphoric joy and success and triumph. So what do you say?
Remember the old movies? Remember the old moving sliding doors? Okay?
Yes.
You make it through the train, you don't make it through the train.
Yes.
I think we're at a sliding doors moment. I completely disagree with Stephen, and we haven't talked global warming, and I think he's completely wrong on that front. Global warming will end.
You don't think that the technology will? I'm just saying, do you not think that the technology will cause more growth?
Technology requires energy. One of my little shorthands, labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. If you don't have the energy, the economy collapses. We're seeing that right now with what the Iran war is doing. We're going to see a 10 or 20% fall in energy levels. Quite literally, when you look at the data, a 10% fall in energy means a 10% fall in GDP. That's as big a downturn as the Great Depression. So that alone is coming our way right now out of this stupid war that should never have been commenced. The side would have the future of plenty. If we don't make the other side, we go back to caveman.
Technology is the solution to climate change. In other words, the only way, if it's really happening, the only way to avert it is through
the only country that's getting there is China. China is the one country that seems to be pushing itself heavily in towards alternative energy, both renewables and nuclear, and it's even got the world's first relatively successful thorium reactor. So America's wasted its time invading other countries, blowing up the rest of the planet, trying to control the oil system, rather than building its own infrastructure.
So
China is the winner.
You're saying China's going to use energy that's twice as expensive as oil, gas, and coal, and somehow they're going to get rich on that. I would bet against that, my friend.
People used to say the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Now we're saying the Strait of Hormuz doesn't always flow, and that's far more significant. We're going to see a huge desire by people, the rest of the world, to liberate themselves from reliance upon oil, whether you think that's economic or not. It's no point about being economic.
You know who tried to do that? Germany tried it. Look at Germany today.
Germany also turned off its nuclear power. Germany turned off its own nuclear power stations. That was monumentally stupid. Okay, China is the one that's been developing the nuclear technology. I think China remembers Good. Okay. China remembers the Opium Wars far better than the rest of the world does. They know they can't trust the West. They're building self-sufficiency and technological leadership. If you want to see technological leadership and where robotics might lead to people benefiting, it's going to be China, not America.
This final exchange is a perfect example of people living completely different realities. One side predicting the consequences based on the data available, the other promising good news based on nothing. Professor Jiang opens with the realistic assessment. We are very likely heading towards a global depression. And Stephen Moore comes back with Fantasyland, that everything is good. And I get it, not everything is terrible and doom scenarios. But Professor Keane complements Professor Jiang's argument very well. Energy isn't just an input, it shapes what capitalism can build. A 10 to 20% fall in energy availability means a 10 to 20% fall in GDP. And it's coming, not from some abstract cycle, but from this war no one, literally no one wanted. Professor Keane connects the dots. America's military obsession with controlling oil is precisely what's destroying the oil system it depends on. And lastly, Professor Keane is also right that China knows they can't trust the West. So they're building self-sufficiency. Renewables, nuclear, rare earth processing, and the technological leadership that actually benefit people. The energy transition that actually works. Not because China is perfect, but because China is focusing in developing and building their future. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you did, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, why does Stephen Moore refuse to admit this war is a disastrous mistake and should end now? See you in the next one.